Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for 1 year after the Myanmar coup, reflections on the origin and ongoing democratic movement of interreligious and interethnic resistance to the coup. Before I begin, I would like to ask everyone to observe a moment of silence to remember those who've lost during the democratic movement. Thank you. So I'm Lien-Hang Nguyen, and I'm the Dorothy Borg Associate Professor in the History of the United States and East Asia at Columbia University. On behalf of the co-sponsors of this event, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the New York Southeast Asian Network, I wanted to say we are so honored to be hosting this event. Myanmar has been a military country since 1962, but the recent military coup deserves international attention. Since the junta seized power by removing the democratically elected government 1 year ago today, on February 1st, 2021, citizens from all walks of life have risen up in strong resistance to the coup. Religion and ethnicity have played a dividing and exclusionary role in Burmese politics, resulting most tragically in the persecution of the Rohingya. However, the urgent need for solidarity of an anti-coup movement led by youth from Generation Z has brought together protesters from different religions and ethnicities. Urban civilians, mostly from ethnic majorities, and ethnic minorities from small towns and the most remote hill villages, have bridged their religious and ethnic divides to resist the coup for the common goal of federal democracy. Within 1 year, the military junta has killed almost 1,500, detained almost 12,000, and has displaced millions of civilians, including hundreds of thousands of children. Despite the risks, civilians continue to resist the new order through various everyday and creative forms of movement. This event, marking the anniversary of the coup, will recognize Myanmar's democratic movement, remember fallen heroes, and reflect on the origins and ongoing movements of interreligious and interethnic resistance to the coup. Our three panelists today, including one who co-led the first largest anti-coup protest and movement on the front lines, will share their expertise on the origins, stories, strategies, and challenges of resistance to the coup. They will also suggest ways that the international community can support Myanmar's ongoing democratic movement. Now, before I introduce our speakers today, our student speakers today, just allow me to remind you of how our Weatherhead East Asian Institute webinars will work. Following my introduction of the panelists, I'll then turn the floor over to our participants for their comments. During their talks, please type out your questions that you may have on the Q&A function in the webinar. When we open the floor to discussion, I'll ask the questions on your behalf. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and they'll proceed in the order that I introduce them. First, Esther Ze Naw Bamvo is a social justice activist and a researcher from Kachin, northern Burma, named one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world in 2021. The resumed civil wars in Kachin region in 2011 encouraged her to become an activist, and she led civil movements and advocacy to all key stakeholders concerning with peace, humanitarian, ethnic, and minority rights issues. In 2021, Myanmar Spring Revolution, she was one of the organizers of the first mass movement started on February 6th in Yangon. Since then, she's worked as a steering committee member of anti-junta mass movement and currently works as unit leader of Kachin Political Interim Coordination Team, KPICT. She is also an executive committee member of Kachin Political Consultative Team, Kachin Youth Policy Working Committee, and a technical team member of National Ethnic Youth Alliance. She is co-founder and director of Candle Library Foundation from 2012 to 2019, which provides non-formal education programs in Kachin internally displaced people's camps, and was also a technical team member of Nationwide Ceasefire Coordination Team during Myanmar nationwide ceasefire agreement preparation process from about 2014 to 2016. Joining Esther is Professor James C. Scott, who is a Sterling Professor of Political Science and Professor of Anthropology and is co-director of the Agrarian Studies program at Yale University. Right now, though, he's living on a farm in Durham, Connecticut, and was for 22 years a sheep breeder and shearer. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study Princeton and the Wissenschaftskollege zu Berlin. In 2020, he was awarded the Albert O. Hirschman Prize by the Social Sciences Research Council. His research concerns political economy, comparative agrarian societies, theories of hegemony and resistance, peasant politics, revolution, Southeast Asia, theories of class relations, and anarchism. His books, which of course all of my students are here today on this webinar are reading, include Domination, the Arts of Resistance, Weapons of the Weak, Seeing Like a State, Two Cheers for Anarchism, The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia, and Against the Grain. He formally retired in July of 2021 and now calls himself Professor Emeritus. He's currently working on an eco-biography of the Irrawaddy River. Finally, last but not least, we have David Thang Moe, who is a Ph.D. candidate in historical theological studies at Asbury Theological Seminary, originally from Mindat, Chin State of Myanmar, currently under martial law. His research focuses on the politics of Buddhist nationalism, ethnic identity, conflict, public theology of religions, resistance, reconciliation, and liberation in Southeast Asia. He's the author of a book, Ph.D. Theology, and has published numerous scholarly articles in encyclopedia, edited books, and academic journals. He's also contributed analysis of Burmese politics of religion, ethnicity, and nationalism for the academic and popular audience in Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, as well as University of Notre Dame's Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, among others. He serves on the editorial teams of 4 academic journals. That's a lot, David. He has been actively engaging in Myanmar's democracy movement as public advocacy speaker of the public protest events in Louisville, Kentucky, and at some universities, including Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, Hamburg, Boston College, Yonsei, ANU, University of Sydney, where I used to teach at the University of Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky University, among others. But without further ado, I do turn it over to Esther. Thank you.
Dear organizers and respected audience, thanks for having me today. I'm really glad I'm here, and I'm Esther Ze Naw Bamvo from Myanmar, and I'm honored to be one of the speakers. I started my activism journey when the civil war resumed in Kachin region, the northern part of Burma in 2011. The atrocity of civil war motivates me to be curious on the outbreak of the conflicts that drives me to work in conflicted areas and to speak up for the oppressed people. So when we glance back the history of Burma and the military rule, we will realize that current Burma military coup has decades-long story. The first coup was in 1962 by Burma Socialist Programming Party, and it ruled over 26 years until 1988 with direct military rule system and constitutional dictatorship system. And the second coup was happened again in 1988 by the military under the name of the State Law and Order Restoration Council, later named as State Peace and Development Council, and it ruled until 2011. And now is the third time of military takeover along the contemporary Burma history. So over these 60 years under military rules, the civilian of the region have been brutally raped, murdered, being used as human shield for the battlegrounds and other various types of brutal acts by a military government. So currently there are over 930,000 of civilians have been forcibly displaced across Myanmar due to the new conflicts and the old ones. So that Myanmar people actively involving in Burma Spring Revolution, not only because of the current military coup, but we have more critical reasons which constructed over 6 decades to achieve. So that the motives behind our struggle are to affirm that national sovereignty is derived from the people, to end authoritarianism, to promulgate a genuine federal union, and to form the democratic country with accountability. So I want to illustrate few about the inter-ethnic movements behind the stage, from which we've seen from the stage. So when the military coup happened and detained the NLD senior members in 1st February, many of Burmese non-Burmese ethnic people do not want to join the resistance movement at first because of the distrust between the majority Burmese and ethnic minority. So since the Burma military junta got a chance to avoid the serious international condemnation for war crimes, crime against humanity, and the genocidal crimes during the NLD-led civilian government, there were also several inter-ethnic and inter-religious problems between ethnic nationalities and NLD. So that the national reconciliation efforts made by the NLD regime was not successful, and that made ethnic forces reluctant to join in at the beginning of the movement. So the revolutionary ethnic armed group also stayed silent in the beginning of the movement. So however, when the public protest groups come up with the basic principles, which in line with the principle that ethnic people are fighting to achieve for many decades, such as to end the military dictatorship, to abolish the 2008 constitution, and to form Federal Democratic Union, the ethnic organizations and other ethnic armed groups started to support the public movements. So among the ethnic forces, most active group we can say are from Kachin, Karen, and Chin based organizations, along with the supporters of NLD from the Burmese regions. So it has been 1 year since the coup happened, and that multi-ethnic and religious community come to unite and fighting against the military dictatorship for their freedom, justice, and democracy as a whole at this meantime. So we will continue this struggle not to fall down under the direct military rule again, as there wouldn't be any room for us to breathe, especially for the minorities. So I also want to, let me continue about my conversation about how youths from Burma, including me, started the movement. So as soon as the coup happened in February 1st, me and my comrades from youth, student, and worker-based organizations discussed about the situation. We become a comrade since many years ago, based on the issues, political issues. So we united again and discussed about the situation. And at the time, COVID restrictions were also remaining, and the military junta security forces were placed around the town as soon as the coup was happened. So they were the biggest obstacles, security concerns for us at the time. And they were such a group of brutal people, you know, and we also aware of the possibility that security forces might open fire as they had done in the past. But we decided to take the risk and started the first mass movement of Burma Spring Revolution. We didn't know it is the first, but yes, we just go out after we discuss, and it was on 6 February with over 5,000 of mostly young people and member of worker union. And we came out in the name of anti-junta mass movement. We demanded 4 basic principles at the movement. First is to end the military dictatorship. Second is to abolish the 2008 constitution, which is the main pillar of the military. And third is to get the genuine federal democracy. And fourth is to free all political prisoners. So those are the principles we always demanded before. And we believe that this is the right time. Even it is not safe, we have to raise our voice in order to liberate from the control of military rules. So we encourage ourselves that if not now, when, right? So when we recall the tide of the movement, we will see the very first online movement flash mob events and civil disobedience movement come out, and they were organized by youths from Mandalay and Yangon. And when people are being stuck to oppose the strongest and powerful military institution in Myanmar, youths did not hesitate to stand up against the military juntas and continue the fight until now. So that is the determination of Myanmar youths to prevail this spring revolution. And we got unbelievable support from the public. Actually, we thought we will be, say, we won't get we will get bad comments, but actually we got an unbelievable support. And actually what I realized nowadays is that people were in stress and wanted to do something, but the darkness of fear created by the military were so powerful and they couldn't escape that. And there were already several groups, especially youths, who prepared and waiting for someone to start, so that we were actually the icebreakers and maybe a dim light for the darkness that brings them hope to come up, for what they are. So it has already been 1 year that we have been traveled this tough journey. So we had to sacrifice a lot for the sake of democracy, against the powerful authoritarian regime. So according to the data of Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, called AAPP Burma, there are altogether 1,503 civilians that the military junta killed on the street, in the prisons, and in interrogation rooms. Also, there are 11,838 prisoners of conscience who are unlawfully detained by the illegal regime, and 1,966 protesters are issued warrant. Many of our comrades are in the list, and also we are in the list. So along this journey, the strategy of Myanmar Spring Revolution has been changed according to the tide of the political situation. So it was started from the civil disobedience movement, which was organized by the Mandalay junior doctors, and then various protests and movements, including formal statements, social, economic, and political non-cooperation boycotts, and last but not least, armed resistance by people, defense forces, and urban guerrilla movements across the country. So my comrades are also now in a prison, and they have been sentenced to over 10 years. They are going to add more, and some already been killed. It is really a tough journey for us, but we are still struggling for our fight and freedom. And from peaceful demonstration to armed resistance, youths play a vital role in the Spring Revolution, we can say, and we also see the proof. And we are still facing the military oppressions, since our previous generation couldn't achieve the dream for peace, justice, and democracy for our country, so that we, the new generation, must take this responsibility to fulfill the dream to achieve peace and to overthrow the military dictatorship. We don't want to be in the darkness anymore. So we also don't want to hand this to our next generation. That is why we are doing this, and we are continue fighting for it. So I also would like to mention about the current challenges. You might also imagine that how massive challenges we are facing, but I want to mention some of them here. So we all expect, for the best, but repeated injuries from the last 6 decades long history has taught us to always prepare for the worst. So there are massive challenges, of course, and forthcoming dangers of economic freefall, food shortage, risks of bank defaults, educational crisis, and health crisis. And of course, all of them are already happening. So the typical scenario finds in the nation shaking on the edge of downfall. So apart from the above challenges, there are significant and heartbreaking challenges we are facing. So since the beginning of the coup, the junta violated the freedom of expression by blocking the internet access across Burma, and up until now, there are altogether 22 towns, big towns, like major towns from the states and divisions, where the internet and even some telecommunications line are being cut off. So Facebook is banned recently, and they even ended the law that whoever has a VPN as phone application, he or she shall be sentenced for 3 years in prison. It is insane, but they are really practicing the irrational laws in order to control the publics. And it is obvious that there is no protest and freedom of peaceful assembly, and no association in Myanmar. So the human rights defenders, CSO leaders, and activists have to put their life on the table and being threatened for speaking out the truth, being imprisoned, tortured, and persecuted unfairly. So the next challenge is the security of the people and freedom fighters. So I have the nearest example to mention today. Just this morning, now it is evening in Myanmar. So this morning in Myanmar time, northern part of Burma, Kachin region in Myitkyina, a 7-year-old boy was shot at chest by the juntas while he was playing in his own house. And the kid was the kid was not a defender nor protester, just living peacefully at his own place and playing, but he is now dead by the gunshot by the military. So similar incidents are happening all over Burma, and that is the example of how everyone from Burma is living under the evil junta fearfully, even they are in their own house. So in this case, people become choosing the armed struggle in order to keep their family safe and secure. So they are being ready to do anything to expel the evil junta from their land, since they don't want to allow the junta to rule over their land. People even expecting a battle, a war to be happen in their land. And even they know that they will become displaced people and their house will be burned down. They keep supporting the local people defense forces with their security concerns. So no matter how much they have to sacrifice, people are giving up anything and donating as much as they can. And it is sad, but it is what is really happening on the ground. And they have no other way to choose to defend themselves. And of course, how the no-armed civilians can imagine to defend themselves from the armed institution with empty hands. So we all want sustainable peace and we all long for that. But what we got is one of the evilest dictatorship in the world. So there is no other way to defend ourselves. So Myanmar people hide expectation and hope over the powerful international communities such as ASEAN, UN, and EU since the military juntas are the strongest and most powerful institution in Myanmar, and people find it difficult to defend by themselves. So here I want to encourage the global policymaking community and scholars to support the side of Myanmar civilians in this spring revolution instead of staying silent or being neutral on the Myanmar crisis and juntas and restraint violence. People are struggling toughly more than you could imagine, So international community also need to recognize, invite, and cooperate with the international government, national unity government. It is really important as the sole representative of Myanmar people, not the military junta. And the international pressures over the corporations who work together with junta is also very important to break the financial change of junta. So for the civilians, creating opportunities, educate, nurture, and support leadership are also a must to continue in this tragedy. Even though we are in this tragedy, the generation should have to continue the education. And it is also important to enhance the voice of Myanmar from each sector, support their capacity, and create financial opportunities. We must have to find the way. And now, now I've already mentioned about the very brief about the whole process. So now you have heard how Myanmar people are fighting for justice, peace, and democracy continuously up to 1 year. So we won't stop this fight and we will continue for the victory no matter what. So we will keep working as much as we can. And I want to request all of you to listen to our laments for freedom. And I want to call all of you to be with us in these hard times, to fight with what you have and against the dictatorship with us. Thank you, and the victory must prevail.
I want to thank Esther, not just for her talk, but for her courage and the courage of her comrades, and for sharing her experience with us. I have been Chino Namega Bamalo, shwayo lo kore, shno yel tekadoma, satin pede. I will switch to English now. And I have been teaching about peasant revolutions for a long time. It's a large part of my career. And I think it's fair to say that even compared to the Solidarity movement in Poland and the Spanish Civil War and the Chilean uprisings, that this is probably the most creative and extraordinary mass movement of civilian populations against a military regime that we have ever seen. Creative in hundreds and hundreds of ways, in flash mobs, in the stringing of tamane across streets in order to shame the military, the banging of pots and pans, the CDM movement itself. And let us not forget this cultural side of this. And I would recommend that those of you who are interested in this acquire the book by Kokothet, which is a collection of resistance poetry published by Ethos Publishers in Singapore that has poetry, not just from the Burman population, but from the resistance from a long time ago up to today, if you want to see the way in which this resistance has been captured culturally and expressed in ways that are deeply, deeply moving. It's also an uprising unprecedented in its scope, its demographic base, and its tenacity. This is not just an urban intelligentsia and students. This is a movement that is spread across villages, the smallest villages in the dry zone, and encompasses the ethnic minorities as well. It's in large part, of course, a reaction to the brutal repression of the military, starting with the sniper assassinations of peaceful protesters. The explosion, I think, surprised, it is said, the military as well as the international community. How massive it was and how generalized it was. But what that does not explain is the long, long buildup of what you might call combustible material in Burma. That is, over nearly 60 years of military rule has been a disaster that has destroyed the life chances of now 3 generations of Burmese subjects. Many, many rebellions over this period have been crushed, most recently, as Esther pointed out, in 1988 and 2008. Tens of thousands of political prisoners, many of whom died while interned, have also been part of the toll of this regime. I should point out that one of the things, as someone who's been learning Burmese for quite some time, is the degree to which prison literature plays a very, very big role in Burmese culture, from the colonial days of the British right through the military regime. You can't go through a page or two of a Burmese dictionary and not have a slang word that comes to us from the prisons and prisoners as well. What is novel here, I think, is that the explosion is now, for the first time, located massively in the Burman heartland. More than 30% of the Burmese population is not Burman, but of course, minority groups, the Karen, the Rakhine, the Kachin, the Shan, the Mun, so on. The ethnic minorities have been in revolt for autonomy for much of the last 60 years. They have been occupied, they have been burned out, they've had their crops and their land seized looted, and endured for forced labor. Much of this has been documented, for example, by the Karen Human Rights Group, which has, if you like, unbelievable detail about the predations of the Tamadol in the Karen area. The plight of the minority groups was not much publicized, nor were, it should be said, were those rights defended by the general Burman population. Now, however, it's the Burman population that is, for the first time, experiencing what the minorities have experienced for many, many, many decades. The result, happily, is a renewed sympathy for the minorities and a sincere interest in a genuine federalism. Since 2010, there was a modest power sharing, as we all know, with the NLD and an elected civilian parliament, even though the military had the important ministries and a veto power over any legislation. But there was quite a free media. Newspapers exploded, books that had been suppressed were now read. Speech that had not been permitted before took place. New organizations were formed. There was an explosion of social media, and one could say a glimpse of a freer world of open discussion, of joining the larger world. And then suddenly the door was slammed shut. I think it was that for the Burman population in particular, it was that period of 10 years during which they experienced at least a glimpse of what an open society and a democratic society might look like, and the kind of free exchange of information and opinion that would be made possible by it. And then, of course, the door was slammed shut in a brutal way on February 1st last year. One could ask why the military has not disintegrated, split, and defected. There are, of course, defections from the military, and it's plagued increasingly by low morale, partly because of the number of military of soldiers who have been killed by the resistance, and by the general demoralization that comes from understanding that they are being asked to obey a regime that they cannot morally defend. The reason why the military has not disintegrated is that the military has been for a long time a completely separate sphere. You could argue that the army was in many ways not a part of Burma. It has its own schools, it has its own hospitals, it has its own housing estate and barracks, its own supply chain for food and consumer goods, its own shops, its own pension system. It also has a system of promotion that is designed to take people hostage. Let me explain. If you are an unmarried soldier, you cannot rise very far in the ranks. You are not considered to be reliable. If you are married and live on the army base, you can go higher into the ranks of promotion. If you are married and have children, you can go much higher still in the ranks of promotion. What it means is that the higher ranks of the Burmese military have wives and families that live on the base, and they have everything to lose by defection. So there is a system, if you like, to tie them and create effectively hostages of their officer corps. They have so much to lose. So it is a long shot for the army to break and for the defections to go to the very top. And one cannot expect a great deal from the international community. Already, I have been surprised, as others have been, by the modest steps that ASEAN and the UN have taken. But they will not do much beyond symbolism and some commercial boycotts. And I don't want to minimize the importance of those commercial boycotts, but they are unlikely by themselves to reverse the army rule. I want to close by at least posing a question, and that is, I think a lot of people at the beginning of the movement believed that the objective was to go back to a shared sovereignty of an elected parliament in consort with some military powers. Back to a kind of power sharing that characterized the period before the coup. I think that is impossible now. Burma may need an army, but it does not need this army. It's unredeemable after what it has done, after its predations in the civilian population, its taking of hostages, its murders, its burning, right? They have lost the last shred of any legitimacy they might have had, even among the Burman population. There's no going back. The resistant population has sacrificed too much to settle for a military with veto power over all legislation. There is simply no legitimacy left for the Tatmadaw as it now exists. So we face a wholly new, unprecedented revolutionary situation. And the thing that is gives one pause is that because there is no going back, there seems to be very little in the way of middle ground, except for the utter defeat of the Tatmadaw and its reconstruction as a truly federal army. And one of the things that actually I think is moving to me is the way in which federalism has already started to exist in small ways. Not only the ethnic armed groups helping the PDF train, a creation of a federal university virtually. That is to say, you could say that the rebellion itself in Burma, the democratic rebellion in Burma, is also a trial period for many, many forms of federalism and cooperation that hopefully will be the basis for a more secure Burma in which the Burmans and all of the minority groups will have the rights that they so deeply deserve. Thank you. Let me turn it over to David Moe, who I've heard many times, and look forward always to how he enlightens us.
I'm having some cold these days, but I'll try my best to make my voice as clear as possible. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Lien-Hang, Nguyen, and the Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the New York Southeast Asian Network for organizing this special event. And also thanks to Professor James Scott and Sama Esther Ze Naw for sharing this panel on this special event of the 1-year anniversary of the coup. Oh, looks like I cannot move to the next slide. Oh, okay. It's impossible to understand the current political situation in Myanmar without understanding the history of the Burma majority Buddhist nationalisms. It's always related to each other. So one could argue that the Buddhist nationalism emerged in Myanmar in in three movements. The first movement, what we can see is in the colonial period, Buddhist nationalism emerged as what we could call it anti-Westernisms. They feel that they fight against the British colonialisms because they want to gain national independence from Myanmar. So that is the first movement. And it was during this time that the current Tatmadaw, the military, the army was also formed. So they always trying to see themselves as the generations of that Burma independence army. So that's why they always say that the army has to exist to protect the nations and the people. That is what the current Tatmadaw always trying to see themselves as the generation of that Burma independence army that was formed in the 1940s. When we gained independence in 1948, that Buddhist nationalism emerged as the anti-ethnic minority groups. It's no longer anti-Westernism because we gained independence from British. So that nationalism emerged as the anti-minority, ethnic minority groups such as Christianity, as well as we can see in the rise of the Rohingya recently. So that is how we see the second movement of Buddhist nationalism. You can see here the picture on the right side here. Some Buddhist nationalists hold the banner. It says that supporters of Rohingyas are enemies. That really is how Buddhist nationalists emerge as the anti-ethnic minority groups in Myanmar. That is still related to the current military coup and its associations with the grassroots Buddhist nationalist movement. Sometimes we call them Amapada. Especially in this second movement, the way the military government built the nation is in a more exclusive way. They want to build Myanmar in their own way of this Buddhist philosophy. They don't really recognize the ethnic minorities' identities and their cultures. So that's why the ethnic minority groups emerge as a reactive response to this the Burma majority-led military government. So nationalism might be a bit more academic language. Let me put it a little bit in a more simple way. When we say Buddhist nationalism, what the ethnic minority face is discriminations. Because the Burma Buddhist majorities have so much of privileges, so the ethnic minority have to face some discriminations and even some cultural assimilations. So for example, in Myanmar, we have the national identity card, ID. You have to put ethnicity, Chin, Kachin, or Korean, or whoever, you have to put your ethnic identity there. And you have to put your religions, Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever. When you have that national identity card and applying some jobs in a society, if you were Christians or none other than a Buddhist, you will automatically face discriminations. So that is the characteristics of this nationalism at the grassroots level as well. So especially in this second movement, what I could say is that make Buddhism great again has been popular among the Buddhist nationalism at the grassroots level, because they feel that Buddhism has been in decline during the British colonial period. After we gain independence from British, they are trying to make Buddhism great again in all forms of life in society. But when we move to the third movement, what I call it, the rise of the new coup changed the political landscapes. It's not just about anti-ethnic minority groups, but it emerged as what we could call it the anti-liberal democracy. So what do I mean by that? The military government also has their own way of democracy, what they call it Sikan Piwato democracy. Sikan means disciplined in English, disciplined democracy. So that is what they say, Sikan Piwato. So that Sikan Piwato democracy is something within the proper actions set up by the military government. If you don't follow that disciplined democracy, then you will face something. You cannot resist the military government because they put disciplined democracy. So you have to follow what they set up the rules within this democracy. It's not quite what we understand here in the West, liberal democracy. It does not to do with freedom of expressions or freedom of opinions. So that is what the military government also has their own way of democracy. So when these the new coup emerged, the ethnic minority groups and the ethnic majority groups, as Professor James Scott and as I have already mentioned earlier, they come together and bridge their different religions and different ethnicities and to counter the military coup as their common enemy. So in the past, the ethnic minority groups are the only groups that they stood against the military government for a long, long time since we gained independence in 1948. But because of this new coup, so now the Burma majority groups also join these ethnic minority groups. So we could even say this is the inter-ethnic reconciliations among, if I borrow a James Scott language, non-state people. So when it comes to the reconciliation in Myanmar, we always think of reconciliation between the military army group and the ethnic minority group, or reconciliation between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military government. We always forget the reconciliation among the non-state people from these different religions and different ethnic groups. So when we see this movement, we can feel that the inter-ethnic reconciliation among the non-state people are happening right now. In spite of so many challenges, we should celebrate that. Interreligious solidarity, interreligious friendship, interreligious reconciliation among the non-state people. So now, this is a 1 year of anniversary. We should ask the question, what is the state of democracy movement 1 year of the coup? I will highlight here two strategies of resistance, especially here in the global context. We always think of this Myanmar democracy movement as a violent movement, especially in the academic world. We don't want to endorse that violent movement. I would like the international community to understand the situation first. I don't believe that the violent resistance group in Myanmar like a violent way of fight. I don't think so. I don't think they like, but they have no options. They begin with the non-violent way of many forms of resistance in the early months of February and March, but the military government create a violent crackdowns on the peaceful protesters. So those peaceful protesters don't have options for their self-defense. That's why they took up some guns and then some knife. Some people even took up some stones to fight back the military coup. It's not just only gun here. I can even point out to the Mindat BDF. Mindat is my hometown, by the way, which is under martial law. So Mindat, the people in Mindat has formed PDF, People Defense Force, right, which becomes CDF to distinguish their Chin identity. So they formed PDF in the early of March, 2 months before NUG formed the PDF in the first week of May. They already formed the PDF for the self-defense. That's why they took up some hunting guns and they fight back against the military coup. Because of their strong resistance to the military coup, Mindat, the small hometown, has been under martial law on May 13th. So Mindat has become the first town in the ethnic minority regions to be under martial law in the history of Myanmar. Because of their strong resistance, you can see here some pictures on the right side below there. So they took up some hunting guns because in our hometown, almost every man has hunting guns because they want to use that guns for hunting, right? So they took up that hunting guns and then they fight back against the coup. As I said, I don't think they like violent way of fighting, but they have no options. That is the only option that they have for their self-defense. And then the other reason is that the military government, because they are one of the strongest military powers in Southeast Asia, there is a tradition that the military government fear someone who has a strong armed group. If you don't have guns, they won't fear you. So that is also a tradition that they have to form with these strong armed groups, and they would like to fight against the coup. That is also another philosophy why this violence resistance has been taking place in Myanmar. So as we understand, when we fight against the coup, of course, on both sides of this defensive or offensive violence, what we can see is the humanitarian crisis. This really, really is a tragic in our country today. So you can see here the first picture on the right side. since our hometown has been under martial law, many people in our town left town and they fled to some jungles. They left their homes in our hometown and they fled to jungles. And then the second picture here, you can see some people left their towns for the neighboring countries. Like for example, Kachin and even Karenni people, they left their homes and some of them fled to Thailand. And in Chin State, since India is our neighboring country, they fled to India, especially in the Mizoram. Even the Indian government does not quite support democracy movement in Myanmar, but the people, the civilians people do support democracy movement, especially Mizoram state, which has this federal democracy. So they welcome so many Chin people in their homes today. That's why here, some people left their towns and they fled to India. And the second picture here is the picture that I got from the IDP in the Kachin. So the Kachin ethnic group is one of the earliest ethnic resistant groups. So these are the pictures. And you can see there, the last picture, that is a Tantrang, which is in Chin State. Hundreds of houses have been burned by the military government. So now what is interesting is that my hometown is now under martial law. The military government recently released a new order. They say that, so now we have to check every house. If no one is there, we will take away it as the government-owned property. That means they are trying to force the people, those who fled to jungles and villages, to come back to their town so that they have human beings to rule, right? So they released this new order last week. So now the people in my hometown have a difficult decision, whether they should go back to their town or they should stay back in the jungles. If they stay back, the military government will take away their houses. So that is the current situations happening in our country, humanitarian crisis. And what I can also share with you today is that although the military coup seems to be power, but they can only control some urban cities. They don't really control some rural villages. Like, especially in my hometown, although my hometown has been under martial law since May 13, the military coup cannot control 100 villages. Those 100 villages have been controlled by the local resistant groups. So that's why here you can see this is one of the school buildings in the village. You can see here the flag. This is not the Myanmar national flag. This is the Chin national flag. So although the military coup control our hometown, our town, inside the town, but they cannot really control some rural villages. That's why now they could teach some students in this school building, and then they erect the Chin national flag. This is, in my view, this is the symbol of future federal democracy in our country. So they just put away the national flag. They just erect the Chin national flag here. This shows that the local civilian fighters still control in rural areas, although they could not control yet some urban cities. So this is something important to remember within this 1 year of the coup. So we may ask here, some ethnic minorities and ethnic majority groups are now fighting against the coup as their common enemy. We should ask, do they really share the same visions? I think the question is yes and no. Yes, they share the same visions to get freedom from the coup, as I mentioned earlier. They don't really like this coup. They don't like it. They don't want to pass this to the next generation. They don't like it. So we have the same visions of freedom from the coup. That is one vision. But however, the ethnic minority have additional visions. It's not just about freedom from the coup, but they also want to get the freedom from these Buddhist nationalisms, discrimination. They don't like that. They really want a federal democracy. They like a federalism in their ethnic regions. They want to elect their own ethnic minority person to lead their nations, their states, their regions, because they really want self-determination, self-autonomy, as Professor James Scott mentioned earlier. They want their own ethnic people to rule the nation, because the problem is that the military government destroying some Christian houses, and even some Christian crosses that we erect at the mountain of ethnic minority, because they don't have their own self-determination, they don't have their own self-autonomy to do whatever they want. That's why they really want their own people to rule their regions. That's why ethnic minority have double visions, I always call it. Of course, they share a vision with the ethnic majority, the Burma group, to get freedom from the coup, but their additional vision is to gain federalism in their own way so that they can lead their own people. So that's why the future of Myanmar federal democracy depends on overcoming the coup as well as this nationalism. We really want to destroy this nationalism ideologically. It's not just this theoretical way, but also this ideologically. Why this Buddhist nation emerge? Because they don't really recognize, for example, Christians' identity, Muslim identity. We should really share these equal identities so that we could build a more healthy, harmonious, as well as inclusive Myanmar. So that really is our future visions. So in order to do that, we really want to recognize the multiculturalism. It's not just about this Burma majority group dominations, but we really want the multiculturalism as the strength for build a new Myanmar. So now this Myanmar is not good. It's a lot of discriminations. It's very exclusionary. We really want the Myanmar as one of the inclusive nation in Southeast Asia. In fact, Myanmar is ethnically and religiously the second diverse nation in Southeast Asia after Indonesia. So we really want to recognize this multiculturalism as a strength for building the future of Myanmar. I really wish I could see that new Myanmar in the near future. I really wish that could be my prayer. So in order to do that, that is my personal thought here, and I think some of the audience might also ask. So when it comes to the federalisms, we always remember the Penlong agreement, right? Which is made in 1947. True, that is a really historic because there was the agreement made by Aung San, who was the the father of national independence, and the father Aung San Suu Kyi. We really respect that Penlong agreement. Yes, we have to remember that history, but on the other hand, if we really want to envision a very inclusive Myanmar, we should also go slightly beyond that Penlong agreement, because not all the ethnic minority group signed that Penlong agreement. For example, Kachin did not sign, Rakhine did not sign, for example, Mon did not sign, only Chin, Kachin, Shan, and some Burma people signed. So in order to build a very inclusive nation, we need to slightly go beyond the Penlong agreement and embrace many other ethnic groups so that we could build a more inclusive Myanmar in the future. So that really is my personal thought here, and definitely some people might have some questions for discussions. So let me conclude my my talk today. I prefer more discussions at the end. So this is our question here today. Does Myanmar have the future of federal democracy? It depends on how we work, I believe, right? So actions. I think two movements, as we already see here, within this 1 year of the coup, internal movement and external movement, still very important. It's still important. So let me take opportunity to thank some international audience, global citizens, for standing in solidarity with us within this 1 year, and please continue supporting us for the external communities. So first, I would also like to urge the international community to recognize the NUG. NUG is a National Unity Government, which was formed to counter the military government. So we urge the international community to recognize NUG as a legitimate government. We urge you not to recognize the military government as a legitimate government. It is not illegal. And the second is we urge the international community to advocate for freedom of Myanmar people. Please share the story about Myanmar among your friends, among your fellow citizens. Please spread this word as much as you can. It's not just in the academic society community, but please share this even in your own small cycles. Please spread the word about Myanmar democracy movement. And the third is more practical. Please financially support some CDM people and IDPS. So CDM are those who stop working in the government So there are a lot of medical doctors, engineers, and school teachers, and many other civil servants stop working. This is a very effective. That's why now the military government cannot really run their mechanism. So this is very helpful. Please support them financially if you can. And I believe that Professor James Scott and his colleagues is it Myanmar Mutual Aid? I think he could share later a little bit. So you could even donate through that networks and other networks. So this is the more practical. And so I really thank every one of you for listening to these talks, and I look forward to further discussions.
Okay, thank you. This now marks the opening of our discussion part of the event. I will not call chair's prerogative, even though I have a ton of questions. You've given us so much to think about, in terms of with Esther opening up about really, the perspective on the ground from Generation Z about the stakes involved for those who participated in this democracy movement. And if you were to stop, what kind of future really is there for Myanmar and for the people there that you cannot stop? To Professor Jim Scott, giving us, his perspective as someone who has long studied resistance movements, that what we see today is so much more creative, so much more innovative than resistant movements of the past in human history, as well as sort of, these challenges moving forward to that if what could happen in Myanmar today be a sort of beacon for true federal democracy, what needs to happen? What needs to happen to this alien, what I think you described this alien institution, that this military is really the stumbling block, to David giving us, this amazing picture at the local level, at the national level, really what stands in the way of Myanmar future, which is clearly this sort of muscular Buddhist nationalism that needs to go, and then very practical ways to be able to achieve that. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A. You have all addressed many of these, but I think that the audience would like possibly for you to give a little bit, to elaborate a bit more. And so what I'm going to do is ask the panelists to open up the Q&A, but I'm not sure if the audience can actually see them as well. So I'm going to summarize as best I can, but do take it in order, because if we were live in person, we would of course call upon the first person's hand we see. So the first one comes from an anonymous attendee, and the question really is about Buddhism and the role of Buddhism. And all three of you will be able to speak to this. The first, of course, of a two-part question is about young people's adherence to Buddhism. Is there a growing discontent amongst Generation Z? The second question deals with this soldier. Now, while Professor Scott has said, this institution of the military is, really exists on its own, how does the individual soldier, though, as a part of this society, reconcile with issues of karma, with Theravada Buddhism, to reconcile what he is doing? And so that's the first question, and I'll turn it over to our panelists. Maybe what we'll do first is to ask Esther, if all three of you, because I think all three of you can weigh on this two-part question about the role of religion and Generation Z, and the role of religion and the incompatibility of a soldier in terms of reconciling sort of his Buddhist beliefs and what he's doing on the ground. So Esther?
I think some of the question is quite related to the theology idea. So I think it it directly related to Sir David. And if I cover something, I will add more. Can you please send it on?
Well, sure. That's a thoughtful question. Here is what I always say. There are two different forms of Buddhism in Myanmar. Buddhism really is a religion of peace, compassion. That really is the central doctrine of Buddhism. But based on what we have seen, what the military coup is doing is this is really the amoral, what I could call it, immoral form of Buddhism, right? So that really creates the boundary between two forms of Buddhism. That's why now some of these young generations Buddhists call it Dhamma and Adhamma. This fight is not just the fight between the military government and Aung San Suu Kyi party. This is not the fight, not like here, Democratic Party and Republican Party. This fight is between Dhamma and Adhamma. Dhamma is the doctrine of Buddhism that is like the way, the truth. So Adhamma is like untruth or maybe evil. So it is clear that they make this a clear distinctions, right? So that's why these young generations, for them, is fighting against the coup this is fighting against Adhamma, which is opposite to what the Buddha is teaching. So I think that is very helpful so that some other Christians and other religious groups even could join. We still respect the Buddhist teaching. This is beautiful teaching, but since we could make the distinction between Adhamma and Dhamma, so we have to join the people, those who fight against Adhamma, I mean those Buddhist people. And also my sense is that although Buddhist nationalism seems to be powerful in Myanmar, but I think that could be just some minority people. It's practiced by some minority people among these Buddhists. Especially the young people, they don't like that kind of nationalism. They really want to create these equal identities between, the Buddhist people and the Christian or maybe Muslim or other religious group. For them, they want to go beyond that kind of discriminations, the Buddhist privileges. So that is something helpful. That's why these young people are very helpful in leading us to the future of this more inclusive Myanmar. So I think that's very helpful. Perhaps a bit more older generations might still have that kind of, Buddhist privileges and all those nationalism, but definitely some young people don't like that ideology anymore. I think Esther could share a little bit more about that.
Yes, that Dhamma and Adhamma is the basic thing that we have to persuade them to be, to defect from the current junta, and we told them about that to stand from the Dhamma, which means the righteousness, right? Yeah. The righteousness, to stand from on the side of the justice and righteousness. If you really are a Buddhist and if you really believe in Buddhism, and we also have to link with the teachings influence over them. So yes, we can say that even yes, according to the questions, that we can think that karma does not include all the actions, but in real life it connects, because the whole nation become involved in this revolution, and also their family members become involving in the revolution, and that directly affect to their daily life, and they become think about that. And I haven't mentioned about the defections of the soldiers in my presentation, in my conversation, but actually I would like to edit more when I prepare for the facts. So I want to mention here that there are altogether over 6,000 of soldiers and police are involving in the defection projects, and now they are involved in the revolution too. And the main thing that we have to influence them is about the karma, the Dhamma and Adhamma, to stand from the side of righteousness. Yes.
So I can add a couple of things perhaps to what Esther and David already said. It is true that I've talked to the people who are working on defections as well. And in a sense, your Dhamma requires that you prevent your superior officers from doing evil acts. You are saving them, right, by preventing them from destroying their own Dhamma. And so what's extraordinary to me is the way in which the people who are working on defections appeal to the sort of better instincts of Buddhist ideology. I think it's fair to say, I'm happy to be corrected by the other panelists, but if we look back at the Saffron Revolution in 2007, what's extraordinary is that the clergy, the Buddhist clergy, was extraordinarily influential. Of course, they were the first victims as well. And the Buddhist clergy has not played a dominant or very prominent role in this particular uprising. Now that, I suppose, is a tribute to the way the military regime has tried to domesticate and silence the Buddhist clergy, also by giving them big presents and tea for their pagodas and their monasteries and so on. So I think it's fair to say that Buddhism as a formal institutional religion has not played a very important role in this last revolution. I have a question that has always puzzled me, that long before the junta took over, one of the things that always struck me was that many of my Burman friends with whom I shared 99% of our view of the world had a negative view of Muslims in general. And what was interesting, and this of course was played up on social media by cyber warfare specialists from the Tabadal, 700 of them, who spread hatred messages about Muslims and Rohingya for 4 or 5 years before the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. So it's not as if it was not manipulated. But what I would hear again and again from people I respected in almost every other respect was that, and this is from men, by the way, there's a gender dimension to this. Men would say, the Muslims are stealing our women. That is to say, as if they owned their women, right? And the Muslims were stealing them. So it had a kind of, I think, a kind of cultural fear of miscegenation of some kind. I don't know. And of course, the argument was then that the Muslims have lots of children and they will overwhelm us, where the demography makes that absolutely impossible and unthinkable in Burma. If you wanted to see a threat from an ethnic group, it would be the Yunnan Chinese, who essentially populate a large part of northern Burma and control its economy. So I was always puzzled by the history of this Islamophobia. And I know that the international Islamophobia has helped it along, but it seems to be actually quite deep, and I am at a loss to completely understand it.
Okay, we'll move to the second question, although I want to ask if David and Esther have a response to Professor Scott's question about the perception of Islam and Muslims.
Esther, you have some thoughts?
We could ruminate on that a little, because I feel like we'll have a question about that again as we talk about interethnic rivalry and the, sort of the role of religion more broadly in the questions from the audience. The next one comes from Ward Keeler. To what extent do you and your colleagues wish to reinstate the former civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi? Do you think it would be better to start over with new elections, perhaps under a new or temporary constitution, or is the best first step to reinstate the NLD government?
Okay. So I would like to mention here about the collaboration beside the NUG that is called NUCC, which is like in a long form, it's National Union Consultative Council. National Unity Consultative Council, and it is created to come up with different composition of stakeholders from CRPH, which is the former elected persons from the especially from NLD, and yes, before the coup, and also from the parties, representative of the parties. And also there are many other compositions like strike groups, CDMs, like CSO, CBOs, and also the ethnic armed organizations, and the federal units are included in that form, that organization called, that council called National Unity Consultative Council. And it was organized to support the NUG and control the policies for the NUG. And within that composition, it is all of the actors are included there, but many of the actors are not being active yet, but they are now having conference just last week and discuss about the future federal democratic, how to form the future federal democratic union. So within that state, on that stage, there are also the NLD and also the former civilian government members are also included there. And it is still discussing, how to start over, or just form new, and how to move on the country in the future. So it is still discussing on that council, and also it is still implementing and imagining how we can go together. So it is still on the process. So we can say that we are going to reinstate the former civilian government or not, or to create a new or temporary constitution or not. We cannot say it yet, but it is still on process, and it is we can say that it is going well until now. So the most important thing is to legitimize the NUG government, and to make that process go on by not supporting the military. Yes.
I think
well.
Perhaps I can add a couple of things. As I said in my talk, although the Burma may need a military, it does not need the Tatmadaw in its present form. Burma may need an NLD, but it does not need the NLD in its old form. During their period of shared sovereignty, they did nothing for more than 1/3 of the population that lived in the ethnic areas. They did not defend the Rohingya. In fact, they defended the actions against the Rohingya. So it seems to me that the situation on the ground has changed so radically that the idea that one could reinstate the status quo ante makes no sense. Another aspect of this, of course, is that areas of the country, large areas now, are self-governing already. That is to say, the Karenni have set up their own sort of police forces and judicial system. That's been true in the Karen and Kachin areas to a considerable extent, in the Chin areas as well. And in the Burma heartland, in Monua and Sagaing area, there are large swaths of territory that the federal government doesn't control at all. So there is a de facto autonomy throughout the country that I think is a kind of lesson, a practical lesson on the ground for the institution of a working federalism. And the NLD, that in its old form, was not a friend of federalism.
Just
Yes.
to
Oh, so Esther, you can add.
yes, to add more, of course, we want the new constitution, new federal constitution for the future, and abandon the 2008 constitution. We don't want that anymore. So yes, of course, we want the new constitution to form the Federal Democratic Union, and it is still on the process, so we can't tell what will happen next. It will depend on how the main stakeholders, especially the NLD, can work more on federal units and so on. The new one focus on the federal units and talk about it a lot, but on the ground, the federal unit is not really formed well yet. But I mean, federal unit means in the ethnic areas, it is we can say that it is forming, and like what Professor mentioned before, we are still in the trial period, and like we are testing and figuring out which way will be the best to go on. But for the federal unit for Burmese majority, they still do not come up with anything yet. So we can say that it will depends on what they will prepare and come up.
Yeah, thank you. Let me add quickly. To add a little bit about what Professor Scott has mentioned, the Buddhist perception of Muslim, which is very interesting to me too. I think some Christians also have some kind of that misperceptions. I mean, because they look at the violence happening in the Middle East. So that really is what they say, the Islam is a really violent religion, right? So one thing. The second is that, of course, they could have so many wives and they could multiply so many children, and that could occupy our land. That really is some fear that the people in the Rakhine area also feel. And so here, the next question is, of course, this NUG is trying its best to handle this issue. Because the international community also give a lot of pressure on the NUG, depending on how they will handle this Rohingya issue, for example, because Aung San Suu Kyi and her party did not do well in the past few years. So the challenge here they have is definitely the NUG, the new government, are happy to give them citizenship, but I'm not sure whether they are brave enough to recognize them as one of the ethnic groups in Myanmar. Because now the Rohingya are not recognized as one of the ethnic groups. Even some Chinese migrant, even Indians, or in American context, they have a green card, but they are not recognized as one of those 135 ethnic groups. So that really is the challenge for the future of Myanmar. So I really don't know how the new government will do for a more inclusive Myanmar, one point. The second is, I think now the current movement is really trying to go beyond both military government and NLD. If I put it, they want to choose the middle way. I mean, that really is popular in the Buddhist teaching, right? The middle way between the military government. Clearly, people don't like military government. And second, there might be some people, those who still like NLD, for example. But if you still stick to that NLD, especially among the ethnic minority group, it's not quite acceptable widely. So they really want to go beyond both this military coup as well as Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, in my view. So that is something important. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I think in your responses, you also might have tackled the later questions about when to open discussion with Tatmadaw, whenever, and it looks like, we can't go back, as Professor Scott has said. So we have a ton of questions. We're getting now, to below the 5-minute mark in terms of our, our event has to end at 10:30, and we're not going to get to the questions. We will collect them, and I'll work with Weatherhead East Asian Institute to see if we can have our speakers respond to them via writing, and we'll post them if we can on our website. But we're unable to be able to get through them. And so this speaks to, let me just sort of divide them into two big questions, because I think they tackle some of the unanswered ones that have been posted, or questions that have been posted by our audience. The first, picking up on what David said, so will this sort of unity stay together now that, the Burman majority and ethnic minorities have a common foe, that is the military? What further work needs to be done at the ground level to keep this unity going? That's sort of a set of questions that a lot of our audience has. The second one deals with sort of the international coverage and also the impact of, say, corporate divestment on the ground. All of you have hit on sort of solutions moving forward, but if you could also, sort of throw any more out there in our concluding minutes. And so if you could just, take your time to answer those two sets of questions. So on the ground, continue unity, what should the rest of the world know or do? And we'll start again, maybe in order with Esther and then Professor Scott and then David.
I'm sorry that I missed the question because I was finding the
I know, I summarized them in one, just questions about how to continue this unity of Burman majority, ethnic minority, religious groups, and having a common foe that is the military, what to do to continue that. And the second question, what does the world community, what else should we know in terms of what is going on the ground?
Okay, yes. I have been involved in and becoming an activist since 2011, as I mentioned before, and I involved here, and it has been like nearly a decade. So during this time, I realized that this is the most energetic and energetic for me. Because like everyone is involving in the revolution, and we are not lonely as we were before. So like Burmese majority also facing the same issue that we have been facing for many decades. So now they know what we have been facing and what we the struggle we had. So the unity come up for sure. And to sustain this, it would depend on how they can sustain their empathy and sympathy, and how can they tone down their privilegedness to work for the people's for the oppressed nations. So it would depend on how long they could work, even if they become privileged again. So the current process, and nowadays this revolution and movement is really important for the future Myanmar to be in one or to be in pieces. So it would also depend on the work of the current Burmese stakeholders, and to be wisely managed in all their speakings and in all their policy making process, especially in the NUG, NUCC, and all the other cooperation works. So if not now, there will be no more cooperation between the ethnics, I think. That is what I imagine, because this is the most powerful time of all year, so of all decades. So this must be the right time, and if not now, we will not be able to reunite again. It is my opinion. So we have to sustain this, and the Burmese stakeholders have to be wisely manage this situation, and it would depend on them.
Again, adding to what Esther said, with which I agree, it's important, I think, to realize that many of the valuable resources of Burma, foreign exchange earners, are in the ethnic areas and not in the Burman heartland. That is to say, the minerals, the timber, the jade, and so on. So in a sense, if the ethnic areas are not included in a working federalism, then the Burman heartland is barely self-sufficient in rice and has not the major resources. It does have the offshore oil and gas, I might add. The thing that has always impressed me is that ethnic minorities know a great deal about the Burman culture and Buddhism and so on. The reverse is not true. That is to say, Burmans have not by and large traveled to the ethnic areas, have not sort of seen both the physical glories of their landscape, the cultural, their cultural practices and so on. So one of the things that I would do if I were forming a school system, I would make a condition of graduation to be a 3-month trip by all graduates through all the ethnic areas where they got to meet local people their own age in each of the ethnic areas, because the balance is completely asymmetrical now, and the minorities know a lot about the Burmans. Burmans know virtually nothing about the ethnic minorities. I want to say also that one cannot imagine a working federalism without much greater control over culture and education and local resources for the ethnic areas, right? That is to say, there's been a process of Burmanization that will have to be renegotiated and pared down. It may be important to learn the Burman language, but not a process of Burmanization or Buddhization, if you like. I'm not very optimistic about international sanctions and their effectiveness, partly because even the oil and gas companies that have exited are still actually paying royalties and will continue to pay royalties for some time to come. I think what is extraordinary at an international level is that this is probably one of those times when the diaspora, the Burmese diaspora in Thailand and throughout the whole world, has played an enormous role in supporting the revolution inside Burma. And I think that is unique and quite extraordinary. And if you like, this panel is an example of that as well. And so I think, given the movement of people all over the world, I have the feeling we're going to see a lot more rebellions and revolutions in which the diaspora play an important supportive role, as they do in this case.
Let me quickly say, right, Hang, I know that you are leaving very soon to teach.
That's okay, David. I'm happy to give you the final word,
yes,
as it should be.
Let me make it a short and sweet message then. So I completely agree with Esther and Professor James Scott, what they have said, so I don't necessarily need to add a lot. I think in order to sustain this unity, it's very important. I mean, as we said, this movement is led by the young generation, Generation Z. So I see myself as Generation Y in that context. So, I mean, those are young people, especially, they are, I mean, very young people there. So sometimes I think they also need to listen to different people a little bit, you know, some scholars or some other activity, a bit, some experience. So I think kind of like this mutual learning, right? So that's really important. Otherwise, because these young people, sometimes they are very quick to make decisions. So it's always need to listen to one another and work together. That will be, as a Generation Y, that will be my advice to those Generation Z as my younger brothers and sisters. That's important. And the second is that, I mean, NUG is now, within this 1 year, what the achievement is that they talk to the international community to recognize NUG, not to recognize the NUG, which is the achievement within this 1 year. I really urge the NUG to turn their back to the local society and listen carefully to the voice of the local people there, BDF and all those activists. Without stop doing, you know, this listening to the internet community. I urge them to listen to the voice of the people more carefully in the next 2 years. Yeah, that will be my conclusion.
Thank you so much, David. I just got from our wonderful staff that we will be able to dedicate space to the questions that haven't been answered, if the panelists are willing to work on them after this event. So with that, I know you can't join me. We'll do a virtual applause to our wonderful panel today. Thank you so much. Okay, and that concludes our webinar.